So, hypothesis-driven science. The observations gained from discovery science will motivate scientists to seek and explain what they have seen, right? To deal with the why as opposed to the what. So, as a process of inquiry, the scientific method is the preferred method by investigative scientists, and it consists of a series of distinctive steps that provide a framework or a guideline for scientific investigations. And there's some modifications of this overall scientific method, but it does have some basic series of steps that we need to look at. So initially, the observation might be that your remote control doesn't work. Okay? That might be just some observation of some event in nature. And your remote control it's technology, but it's part of our environment. It sparks a question, what's wrong with the remote control? Why doesn't it work? The question can spark an educated guess as to why the remote control doesn't work. And in science, our educated guesses are called hypotheses. So you would develop a hypothesis that possibly the batteries are dead. And that is possible because you have some experience with remote controls, and most of us know that they are operated by batteries. And because of our experience, we know that if a remote control doesn't work, one good educated guess, one good hypothesis would be that the batteries are dead. An important critical component of the hypothesis, where's my cursor? Here we go. Of the hypothesis is that you should be able to test it or evaluate it. Well, you would test it by generating a prediction that changing the dead batteries should cause the remote control to work. Notice that the hypothesis, the educated guess, should be set up so that you can test it, evaluate it, to see if it's true or not. The experimental part, you replace the batteries, then you test the remote control. By testing the remote control, it will either work or it will not work. That's the data, the results of the experiment. So the experiments will either support the hypothesis that the batteries were dead and that's why the remote control doesn't work, or if you switch out the batteries and you know that the batteries are good and the remote control doesn't work, well, now you go back and reevaluate the hypothesis and come up with a new prediction based on a new hypothesis. So it is supposed to be a self-correcting process, the scientific method. Okay? If the experiment does not support the hypothesis, you go back to the hypothesis and revise it. If you know the batteries are good, if the remote control still doesn't work, well, maybe something's wrong with the TV. Okay? So the point is that the evaluation of the experimental results allow you to see if your hypothesis is right or wrong. If your hypothesis is correct, in this simple scenario, problem is solved. You know why the remote control didn't work. If the replacement of the batteries still does not cause the remote control to work, then you revise a hypothesis. Your educated guess has got to be a different educated guess. Okay? And this is how science generally tends to work, and how we gather information and determine if the information is correct or incorrect in terms of our hypotheses about what we see in nature. So this hypothesis-driven science works this way. Most scientific investigators use a hypothesis-driven science approach. So the hypothesis, it's a tentative answer to a question, that educated guess, or it's a proposed explanation for something that's observed in nature. Okay? So it's a substantial, supported, educated guess, a hypothesis. In standard English language, hypothesis sounds like a weak guess. In science, a hypothesis is an educated guess based on knowledge that scientists would have. Okay? So a good hypothesis leads to predictions that can be tested by experiments. That's very important. So know the steps of the scientific process. It will probably come up on a quiz and or an exam. So once a hypothesis is formulated, it can be used to make predictions about the results that would be expected if the hypothesis is correct or incorrect, right? If the batteries are truly dead, replace the batteries with good batteries, the thing should work, all right? Or if you replace the new batteries with new batteries, you replace the old batteries with new batteries, and the device doesn't work, well, you have to revise the hypothesis. So when the hypothesis is tested, it's performed, the testing of the hypothesis is by performing an experiment. And in real life, in real science, it's not just one experiment, it's many experiments, so that your results can be substantial and are able to be analyzed, usually by statistically. So in a standard lab, when they're predicting, making predictions based on a hypothesis and they're developing experiments, they'll run dozens of experiments at least to be able to get enough satisfactory answers to determine if the hypothesis is correct or incorrect. And that's probably my cat you hear in the background. Hey, Tunsus. Okay. So theories in science. So accumulating facts is not the principal goal or primary goal. That's what this means, primary goal of science. Facts are verifiable observations and repeatable experimental results that are prerequisites of science in terms of knowledge, in terms of understanding our world. So advances in science are theories that are tied together under a vast number of observations that previously might have seemed unrelated. So this is a little drawing of Galileo observing movements of the planets, and through numerous observations, he was able to determine that, hey, the way the planets move in the sky, the night sky, can be explained by the planets revolving around the sun. At his time, many people thought that the Earth was the center of not just the solar system, but the universe, and everything revolved around the Earth. So through many observations, Galileo was able to show that that really is not correct, in the sense that his observations do not support what's called an Earth-centered universe. So the cornerstones of science today are the explanations that apply to the greatest variety of phenomena. So theories that are broad and can explain much of the natural world around us. So people like Isaac Newton, think of the law of gravity, Charles Darwin, right, theory of evolution, Albert Einstein, theory of relativity, and lots of other stuff. They stand out in science and modern science because their theories had such huge explanatory power of numerous things that we see in nature. So what is a scientific theory? I've been using that term. And how is it different from a hypothesis? Well, a theory in science speak is like a law, if you want to think of it that way. It's a comprehensive explanation supported by abundant, copious evidence. And it's general enough so it can spin off many new testable hypotheses. So I mentioned a hypothesis is like an educated guess, but a theory is much more substantial. Think of it as a law. So we often say, the law of gravity, but in a way it's really the theory of gravity. So for example, these are hypotheses. White fur on an animal is an adaptation that helps polar bears survive in the Arctic habitat. Okay? Another one, the bone structure of a hummingbird's wings is an evolutionary adaptation that provides an advantage in gathering nectar from flowers because the bone structure is very lightweight. Right? In contrast, right, the following theory ties together these seemingly unrelated hypotheses because the theory is much broader and stronger. Adaptations to the local environment evolve by the process of natural selection. Okay? That's a theory as opposed to these two smaller in scope hypotheses. So theories only become widely accepted by the scientific community if they are substantiated and supported by extensive research, a lot of evidence, and have not been contradicted or shown to be wrong by scientific data. So Charles Darwin came up with his theory of evolution, over 160 years ago. And he published his book, right? 1859, right? On evolution. And since 1859, there's been no valid scientific evidence to show that evolution does not occur. That's a very long time. So let's look at the nature of life on Earth. And I mentioned earlier that there's no real one single strict definition of what is alive, but let's look at what our textbook talks about anyway. The phenomenon of life does defy a simple definition. We can recognize life mainly by what living things do. So there are 7 basic properties and or processes that are associated with living things. One is they have a lot of order. Even a pine cone, right? The way it's structured, it's a lot of order to that structure of the pine cone, or the structure of, say, the bones of an animal. Okay? So physical structure is very important and characteristic. It's a property of life. Regulation, like body temperature. Humans, for example, we maintain a regular body temperature throughout the day. Things like reptiles have to either sun themselves in the morning to get their body temperature up to a certain amount, but they're able to regulate, for example, other things like, salt concentration or blood sugar concentration in their bodies, just the way humans can. So there's a lot of regulation in living organisms. Growth, that's pretty straightforward. When you were first born, you were smaller than you are now. That's because you're able to grow. And also you're able to develop. So you were conceived and you started out life as a single cell, fertilized egg, something called the zygote. But during embryological development, there was a lot of changes. Then you were born, you grew, and there was still more development. Think about all that fun stuff that happened at puberty. Okay? Living things can harness and process energy. As consumers, we have to eat food to harness the energy, chemical energy in the food we eat. Plants, for example, can photosynthesize and use sunlight energy to feed themselves, but that's energy processing. Okay? That's a property of life. Also responds to the environment. Okay? This Venus flytrap, it responds to being touched by a fly or some other insect in these modified leaves, and then they'll slap down and capture this thing and actually digest it and consume it. You respond to the environment. If you see a flash of light, you're going to look towards it to see what it is. If you hear a sound, you're going to try to evaluate that sound, maybe turn your head so you can hear it better. That's responding to the environment. Okay? Living things can reproduce, right? Sexual reproduction is how we came into existence as individuals, but even single-celled organisms, like, say, bacteria that do not have sexual reproduction can still reproduce at the cellular level. Your skin cells are constantly replacing each other through a type of reproduction called mitosis that we'll look at later. And then things evolve over time. So evolution is another property of life. Okay? So 7 properties of life. You don't have to necessarily know all 7, but the more you can remember, the better off you are on quizzes and exams. So let's talk about life and its diverse forms in the next section.